So let's take another look at SynthScaper. This is a complex app, and of course when learning to work with any complex app such as this, we're really working on two different levels or parallel tracks. The first thing is we've got to learn what all the knobs and buttons actually do, the mechanics of the app in other words. But even once we've learnt all of those things, we still have to figure out how to do anything useful or interesting with the app. And I suppose we're typically doing these things in parallel, playing with the app and figuring things out as we go. So we're going to look at both of those aspects of learning today. In terms of finding out or figuring out what we can usefully do with this app or how to make things happen in interesting ways, a very helpful way of approaching that is to take some of the presets. This comes with a huge number of very interesting presets, but to take some of those apart and see how they work. So we're going to do a little bit of that later on. But first I want to come back to the mechanics of the app and talk a bit about, possibly a lot about, modulation. Now, in particular, I want to look at modulation of parameters in a performative sense or a live sense. Now, it'll come as no surprise with an app as detailed and sophisticated as this that you can map pretty much any parameter to any control. I mean, just as an example of that, if we went to the keyboard for Oscillator 2, we looked at we're on the modulation and velocity tab. If we look at the MIDI 1 mod, that would be the modulation wheel on your keyboard. I have a joystick rather than a wheel. If we select what we want to map to that, we could choose, so this is Oscillator 2, layer 1, level. That's what we've got at the moment. And so that's mapped one parameter to a MIDI input. And we can do that in enormous detail. You know, under the keyboard setting, we've got the common MIDI parameters. That main mod to the top left there is the finger swipe up and down on the keyboard. It's the virtual keyboard. This preset has got two independent keyboards, so the additional mod is the finger swipe on the secondary keyboard, and so on. We can do that in more detail if we went to the app MIDI assign. So I'm not going to go into any detail there. That's where you would map individual parameters. Now, in passing in that keyboard setup, you'll see references to two special controls called Effect1 and Effect2. Now, these have the special property that we can map more than one parameter to those controls. And I should say, when I'm talking about mapping parameters, if we go into the oscillator setup, the parameters I'm talking about are the ones listed along the bottom right of this dialog. So the level, the balance, the low pass filter cutoff, the high pass filter cutoff, the address mask, well, the address mask shift, that is, and the pitch. Those are the parameters that we can play with for each layer of each oscillator. Now, the thing about those two special controls, Effect1 and Effect2, they have the unique property, not sure if unique is the right word because they've both got it. They have the special property of being able to, we can map more than one parameter to, let's say, Effect1 at the same time. And then when we vary Effect1 by, for example, binding Effect1 to the mod wheel, all the parameters that are bound to Effect1 vary simultaneously. And this is a very obscure but extraordinarily powerful feature of this user interface that you may not figure out just by tinkering. So we're going to look at that in a little bit of detail. Now, I'll say something else here. These two controls, Effect1 and Effect2, the names are not particularly helpful, and you shouldn't confuse these with if we go to the filter tab, this is where we can set up for each oscillator up to 3 effects in a chain. I'm saying effects because they're not all filters. We've got a low pass filter and a chorus. That's not a filter, that's an effect, and an amplitude modulator. These effects are nothing to do with those special controls which are called Effect1 and Effect2. And in fact, in my previous video I got that wrong, and so I've added to the confusion there. So to see how things get mapped to Effect1 and Effect2, we need to go in and look at the LFO and envelope setups. So let's just start off with a blank preset, so we don't have anything set up. Go for empty scene. We've got empty scene, so we've only got one oscillator active, that's oscillator 2. If we go in there, the only things are set up, there's an envelope set up, we're going to just take that off, we don't need that. We've got only one of the layers has got a sample set up. We're going to change that sample to be, instead of a sine wave, a square wave, just because it's a little bit easier to hear the, well, it's not as subtle as a sine wave. Alright, so we're going to look at how to hook up parameters to Effect1 and Effect2 in parallel, so we can modulate them live using using whatever we map them to in terms of controls. Now, it's not immediately obvious why we need to look at LFOs to do that, but this is just a feature of the way the app's been designed, and as we get into it, it begins to make some kind of sense, I hope. Now, something else to say is we can usefully just look at one oscillator because the 3 oscillators are completely independent. All the things we're going to say here are, in a sense, compartmentalized for oscillator 1, 2 and 3. So we're just looking at oscillator 2 here for now. And so coming to these parameters along the bottom of the screen, we'll focus on one of these in particular as an example. We'll just focus on the level parameter. So that's the volume, if you like. Ooh. And if we click the LFO button, we get to this screen. Now, if you try to set up an LFO, you've probably done this if you've got this app. It's very confusing. It's not at all straightforward because this is a very complex, and I have to say, quite confusing dialogue. Now, just I'll say this for what it's worth. You can take 2 approaches to analysing this dialogue and this application. One is you can take a very critical approach to the design of the user interface and so on, or alternatively you can take a very appreciative approach of the amazing and somewhat overwhelming complexity or flexibility that the app is capable of. And I'm going to try and take the latter approach, but it won't stop me from saying some slightly critical things from time to time. So what's going on with this dialogue? Well, we've got, this is essentially like a tabbed dialogue. We've got 6 LFOs available. And if we look at, if we just press these buttons along the top, nothing changes because they're all initialized to, well, uninitialized at the moment. But if I were to change something, just select square wave instead of sine, you'll see that flipping between 1 and 2, that they're now different. Now, the first helpful observation about this dialogue is the 6 it does 2 things. Essentially, it's a double dialogue. In fact, if you look at the title bar, although when we got into this, we just got into it by pressing a button labelled LFO, the title bar actually says something slightly more helpful. It's LFO/effect parameters for the parameter level. And in fact, to set up the LFO, the 6 knobs at the left hand side of this dialogue are irrelevant. So if you can kind of blank those out in your mind, the dialogue becomes somewhat more simple in the first instance. So just to set up the LFO as an example, some things we can leave at default. We've got the rate is already set to 1 second. We've got a sine wave selected by default. Underneath the word assign, we've got O2, which stands for oscillator 2, L1, which is layer 1, level. Level is the parameter. That's the current value of the parameter. We can leave that alone. Doesn't matter what that is for our purposes. Delay, we can leave that alone. The bottom right of this dialogue is how the LFO is going to affect the parameter. So we want to be able to vary the parameter, the level, across its full range of 100%. So we're going to slide that up to 100. Phase we can comfortably ignore for now. The last thing we have to do is set the depth of the LFO to non-zero. Now if we put that up to 100, we can see a waveform on the graph there. That should give us an LFO that we can hear now. The last thing we have to do is click assign, which is that button at the top right, to actually activate it. There it goes. So on a 1 second cycle, it's varying the level. If we change that rate, up to, well, in fact what we'll do is if we click the short button, it changes the scale of that, that graph. And you can vary that. Okay, so that's how to set an LFO, and we haven't touched those knobs at the left. Now then, the main purpose of coming into this dialog wasn't about the LFOs, it was how to bind things to this Effect1 and Effect2 parameter. So if we shift our focus over to the left hand side of this screen, ignore the LFO stuff for now, and look at these knobs. We've got two columns of knobs. One is about Effect1, the control, special control, Effect1, and the other is Effect2. So if we look at Effect1 exclusively now, we've got the top knob is the current value of Effect1. Now that's a control that's basically got a center and you can vary it left and right from that. We're not bothered about that, we'll leave it at 0 for now. If this was mapped to your mod wheel, for example, you'd want that to be at sort of 0 when your mod wheel was like halfway up, and then you could vary it up and down. So we're going to leave that at default. The amount, now the amount is how much the effect, when we vary the Effect1 control, how much it's going to affect this or influence this parameter. If we set that to 100%, that means that in this case we were playing with the level. If we vary that Effect1 slider, it's going to affect the whole range of the level. Now, because we've got an LFO set, it's worth sort of just thinking about this in terms of like a chain. So the LFO happens, and then the output of that LFO, whatever that's done to the level parameter, is then affected by the position of that Effect1 slider. Now we need to take a side trip here before we get any further with this. If we're going to close these two, if we go to the keyboard setup for Oscillator 2, if we look at keyboards, the screen main keyboard is active. We've got a modulation velocity, the main modulation, which is the screen keyboard finger swipe, is set. This is the top left of this dialog here. This is set to Effect1 value, so that's fine, that's what we want. That means that if we go back into where we were looking at that LFO, again looking at the leftmost column here, when we operate that finger swipe, this is telling us we're going to affect the level parameter across 100% of its range. So if I click on the keyboard and drag, well, that's hard to hear any effect there. I need to do a couple of things to make, that's not immediately obvious what's going on there. What I'm going to do first of all, I will reduce the depth of the LFO to like 50% or something. So you can now see that swiping up and down is affecting that output. I'm going to go one step further. If I click the assign button off, so this LFO is no longer active, that doesn't deactivate the mapping of the parameter to the Effect1. Now that's actually very confusing. If you were tinkering with this and didn't understand what was going on here, you might think, as I thought for a long time, that the assign button basically switches this dialog, the whole functionality of this dialog on or off. That's not the case. It switches the LFO on or off, doesn't influence the Effect1 and Effect2. So what that means is, although we don't have the LFO active, we should still have that finger swipe controlling the Effect1 parameter, which in turn is controlling the level parameter. So I'm swiping up and down, and we're controlling the level through 100% of its range. And you can see that on that graph, you can see the green line moving up and down. Now I'm not going to explain in enormous detail what all these graphical things mean. You have to figure some of this out for yourself, or we're here all day if I try to explain everything. So that's how to hook up one parameter to the Effect1 parameter, but as we saw earlier, the special thing about hooking things up to the Effect1 or Effect2 is you can hook up more than one thing at once. So if we were to flip out of this, and so that was the LFO setup for the level parameter. If we change the balance parameter as well by clicking on the LFO button underneath balance, now we get the same dialog back. We're still looking at LFO1, but if you look at the title bar, in brackets we've now got a different parameter. We've got balance, and if you look at the top right of this dialog, we've got Oscillator 2 layer 1 balance instead of level, and at the bottom right we've got two knobs which are specific to the balance. Okay, so just another thing that's very confusing about this dialog. We are sharing this LFO. This is LFO1. We're sharing this currently with the level parameter. Some of the things on this screen refer to the shared part, which is the LFO itself. Some of the things on this screen are unique to the particular parameter. So, for example, if we look, we've got the waveform on the screen. It's a sine wave. We've got the depth set to 51.2%. If we click out of that and go into the LFO for level, those things are the same. It's a sine wave, depth is 51.2%, the rate is 0.1. If we change that to a square wave, close that, go back into the LFO for the balance, we can see that's changed to a square wave as well, but we're still on a rate of 0.1, depth of 51.2. If we look over to the right of that screen, we've got a dial that's specific to the Oscillator 2 level 1 balance parameter. I would just tweak that up to 25. We've got range 0 at the moment. Remember those, if we click out, go back into the level, LFO setup for the level, that dial at the top right is actually on 100% instead of 25. The dial at the bottom for the range is on 100 here, whereas for balance it's set to 0. So, oh God, this is very confusing. But so what you have to know is that sort of central portion of the screen, roughly speaking, is about the LFO. Those bits to the right and the bottom are about the particular parameter. Anyway, forget all that. So, LFO1, it's a sine wave. It's got a rate of 0.1 seconds, depth of 50%. If we put that depth back up to 100%, we're going and we want to use this to modulate the balance as well. So we need to go around and say, right, balance we'll set to central, start from the center. We're going to vary it through a range of 100%. If we click the assign button, we should hear that for the balance right away. Let's just change the rate down a bit, so we can hear that panning back and forwards on 0.7, 0.8 second cycle. If we go back to where we had the level mapped to the LFO, if we click that assign on again, we should hear both those together. So we've got two parameters mapped to the same LFO, in other words. I suppose in passing we can see what the value of that, what the usefulness of that phase parameter is. Again, the phase is under LFO2 param, so that is specific to this. We're looking at the level parameter at the moment. If I change that phase by 50%-ish, you can see the graph shifts there as we do that. But what we should see is the modulation of the level and balance. The phase should change. Now let's just try and, well, you can't really tell, but if I vary that dynamically, I'm not sure if you can tell that or not. If I change the rate to be faster, we'll try it again. Well, something's going on there. It's not easy enough. It's not that easy to figure out what it is. Yeah, so that's interesting. So when you've got a short period for the LFO there, that's a little bit easier to detect. You get sort of beats as the two things come in and out of phase. But the important thing that we're interested in for this demonstration is if I just turn off the assign for that, that's the level, and also the turn off the assign for the balance. So remember, this means that the LFO is no longer active, so we don't get any variation. The binding to the Effect1 control is still active. Actually, I haven't bound the balance to the Effect1 control. If we go into if we look, this is the level. If we look to the left of the screen, the amount is set to 100 under Effect1. We go into balance, we'll set that to 100 as well for Effect2. So now that means the finger swipe should control both the volume and the level. The level and the balance. So what's happening there is, as it gets louder, it's moving to the right. As it gets softer, it's moving to the left. Let me do that. Again, we can adjust the phase. If we put those 50% out of phase. So there we go. That's binding two different parameters to the Effect1 virtual control. And just thinking about the numbers here, I need my crib sheet for this because it gets very complicated. So as I've said, the three oscillators are entirely independent, but for each oscillator we've got 3 layers. Each layer has 6 parameters on it: level, balance, low pass, high pass, address and pitch. So that's a total of 18 parameters, independent parameters, and we can bind as many of those as we want to the Effect1 control, or to the Effect2 control, or indeed to both. Not sure why we'd want to connect them to both, but we could do that. So we could in theory have 18 parameters varying simultaneously when we adjust the whichever control we've bound to Effect1. In fact, it's even more complex than that, because if we switch over to the filter tab, which we can now do incidentally by this new bar across the top of the screen without clicking out of this dialog. Again, this is for Oscillator 2, so we've got 3 independent effects in the chain, and each of those effects can have 2 parameters assigned to LFOs. Now these LFOs are the same 6 LFOs, they're distributed 2, 2, 2, but they're the same ones. If we go into there, we're looking at LFO1, which is the one we've already set up with that sine wave. But what this means is we've got, not only do we have the 18 oscillator parameters that we can bind to, let's say, LFO1 at the same time, we can also bind up to as many as 6 of these parameters from the effects chain to Effect1 at the same time. So we can, in other words, we can have up to 24 different parameters varying simultaneously with that Effect1 control. And just another thing to say is Effect1 is hardwired, if you like, to, on this main soundscape screen, it's this slider at the bottom left of the sort of petal of, I'm tweaking it now, of Oscillator 2. So that's varying the value of Effect1, and the one opposite on the right hand side is actually the Effect2 slider. But in practice you would want to bind those two, either the finger swipe or the finger swipe on the secondary keyboard, or perhaps map them to controls on your MIDI keyboard. I think we've got that mapped. That's mapped by default to the MIDI mod wheel, MIDI 1, main MIDI modulation wheel. So I don't know if that's made any sense at all. Maybe that's just made this even more confusing than it was before. I did actually try and draw a simple diagram of all this stuff, and you know, I had several attempts at this. Pretty much turned out to be impossible, I think, to do a simple diagram. And it doesn't stop there. We should briefly look at, I'm not going to look at this in any detail, but coming back to where we set up the LFOs, you'll notice that each parameter can also be hooked up to an envelope. And in that envelope screen, we have a similar kind of partitioning of that screen. In a sense, only the left-hand side is about the envelope, and the right-hand side is about binding modifications to that envelope to the Effect1 and Effect2 controls. So again, we can affect that with the finger swipe. It's already set up here. I'm not sure why that's already set up. I didn't set that up. Maybe when we load that empty preset. Let me try that. Goodness me. Oscillator, Env1, Effect1, attack. Oh yeah. So the attack is changed. That's pretty boring. But if we change the sustain, well, anyway, same sort of deal. We won't go through that in any detail. Yeah, so just one last little taster of how powerful all this stuff is. If we go back into the, let's make it balance rather than, we'll set up this LFO again. We'll set it up for the balance. We want 100% depth, 100% range. Now you might be confused by the way what's the difference between range and depth? They seem to do the same thing. Well, you'll notice that depth is in the LFO section. That's a function of or a parameter of the LFO. And so if you bind 10 different parameters to the LFO and then you change the depth, it affects all those parameters. The range parameter the range value is per parameter. So you can bind 10 parameters to the LFO, but at different ranges. So you can have, let's say the level varying over 50% of its range, with the balance varying over 100% of its range, the low pass filter cutoff varying over 10% of its range, and so on. So that's the range parameters are the range values are per parameter. The depth parameter is per LFO. But for now, we've set them both to 100. We've got a sine wave. I'm going to assign that. So we've got this very freaky. Let's just make that a little bit. Very freaky panning of that sound. What's kind of interesting, if we have that finger swipe. Oh, why is that set to 60? We've got the finger swipe is still back. That's set. That's by default will be controlling the Effect1. We've got amount set to 0. If we put that to 100. What we did before was we used the Effect1 to vary the value of the parameter, which in this case is balance. So if we were to do that again, we would hear when the LFO is active, the amount of that panning increases or decreases with the finger swipe. If we deassign that, we're basically just controlling the balance with the finger swipe. If we turn the LFO back on, instead of changing the value with Effect1, if we put that back to 0, if we look down to the next knob, this actually controls parameters of the LFO. I hope you're keeping up with this. And by default it's the depth. So if we control the depth of the LFO by 100%, swiping the finger should make that panning become less or more obvious. And actually helpfully, you can, if you watch the graph in the middle of the screen, you can see that going up or down. But we can also change, I think more interestingly, instead of depth, if we click on where it says depth over at the left here, we can actually change that to rate. We've got rate or depth. And so if we click and swipe in there, actually there's a bug there, that says, when we click and vary that, that says depth amount. When that is set to rate, that should be saying rate amount, but anyway, it's just a little bug. So we're now going to vary the rate with the finger swipe. Which is pretty cool. So you can see, you can just get out of your head with all of this stuff. Don't know what random does. So that's what I wanted to say about the modulation, the live modulation of parameters using the Effect1 and Effect2. So moving on, let's just get a flavour of some of the other part of the learning process, if you like, which is how to do interesting or useful things with all that stuff. And we'll do that by looking at some presets. Now most presets have got a fairly conventional, I suppose, instrument-like quality, at least in part. This one, so this is kind of piano-like, and I guess most presets are going to have some sort of element, at least of, it's going to be sort of piano-like or organ-like in some way. But SynthScaper does give us features we can use to get much more sustained effect-like sounds as well. And if we just look at an example of that, this one, drone's long gap drink. I don't know what sense that makes. So that's much less of a conventional piano. You couldn't play a tune on that. Definitely not a tune like. So we just take a quick look at this. We look at Oscillator 2. We bring it up. So we're going to mute Oscillator 1 and 3. And look at Oscillator 2. It only has one layer to it, and it has that modular bass sample. It's interesting that effect bears very little relation to the basic sample. So how's that being achieved? Well, God, where do we start? We're using fixed octave and fixed note. That means wherever we hit the keyboard, we're going to be playing an E in octave 7. That means it's like we've got 88 E's that they're all the same note, essentially. We're on microtonal now. I'm not really 100% sure. To me, I think that means that to get an octave, we normally have 12 steps. If we set microtonal and we dial this up to 119, that means that to get from E to E, an octave higher, there's 119 steps instead of 12. Now the trick here is to strip away piece by piece the layers of complexity in a sense, to reveal the underlying structure. Now the first thing we're going to do is, I happen to know there's an arpeggiator set for this, and so the first thing we need to do is turn that off. We click the arpeggiator button at the top, we get to that screen. We'll come back to this, but I'm going to click active off for now and go back to the oscillator screen. So that simplifies things. We've got an envelope and LFO for the level, so something's going to happen with the level swelling in and out. We've got an LFO for the balance. We should be able to turn that off for the balance without affecting too much of the sound. We've got an LFO. Let's try turning off the envelope and the LFO for the level. So that's helpful, that. So you can see we've got the same basic sound, but it's less subtle. Turn that envelope back on. That's very subtle. If we turn the LFO back on, yeah. So we leave those two off. Now all we've got is something going on with the pitch. If we turn off the envelope for the pitch, turn it back on, if we leave that off, and if we look at the LFO for the pitch, so the interesting thing here is if we direct our attention to the top right of this display, we've got oscillator 2 level 1 pitch varying on a square wave plus or minus 3,175 cents. So what's that? That's 31.75 semitones, I think. And is that semitones on our 119 step octave? I think so. So it's varying on a square wave randomly across that range when we hold the key down. If we reduce that range drastically, we've actually got oscillator 1 playing as well. Sorry, that's why we're getting that drone in the background. Turn that off. So if we set that range back up to 3,000 whatever, and it's on a rate of just under 3 seconds. We change that rate to be very short. We could change it from random to, well, what does that do? So I guess that's just going from the extremes of that 3,175 cents. And if we change that to a sine wave, it's varying between those extremes along a sine wave. But the square wave cuts out the graduations. And what do we do if we get a sine wave and random? What does that do? So you can see we're taking away layers of complexity, and we're getting to the, you know, the elements of this patch. So we have to restore those levels of complexity now. So that's all as it was. We put the envelope back on. We won't tinker with that. If we go back to the level and put the LFO back on by assigning it, we get that sort of bird-like, you know, outer spacey kind of quality. It's very kind of Hawkwind or Pink Floyd. It's almost like, you know, guitar noise through an effects chain. We've probably got effects going as well. If we look at under filter, yeah, we got a flanger. Well, anyway, on a delay, that's why we're getting some of that echo. So the last thing I'm going to look at on this patch is to go back to so when you hold the key down, you know, you get the sound, then it tails off. So you can keep playing it. But remember, this was set up on an arpeggiator. So if we go back to the Oscillator 2 and click the arpeggiator button and activate it again, if we hold down the key now, it recycles. And it does other things. And again, without going into the details of the arpeggiator has now become a sequencer as well, by the way, with the upgrade to 1.5. So that, you know, that was already quite complicated. But this is just arpeggiating, and what it's doing is it's basically taking that fixed octave, fixed note, but it's throwing in randomly plus and minus 1 and 2 octaves, and it's doing that on a regular pattern. So we've got four beats in the cycle. So there you can see that's how to get an effect like sustained sound as part of your patch. And if we put the rest of these oscillators back in by unmuting them, we've got that effect layered over a kind of a drone. If we cut out 2 and 3, filter oscillator 1's just this kind of drone sound. Oscillator 3 is well, we're going to look at that one as well, I think. That's pretty cool for other reasons. So just moving on, looking at pulling apart some of the presets. On this same scene preset, we're going to look at Oscillator 3, which has got a thing called Fizzy Drink in there. So Oscillator 3 has 3 layers. Layer 1, we're going to mute that. And in fact, we mute layer 1 and 3, listen to layer 2. Listen to it, it's kind of quiet. Layer 3. That's the fizz, I suppose. It's using this sample called Grinder Wheel, which is a noise sample. I suppose what's the interesting part about this is if we look at the radial part of this display, you've got some major animation going on, and particularly those green sliders at the extremes. Those are the varying values of the low pass and high pass filter cutoffs. If you just direct your attention to layer 3, which is the bottom right part of this circle, these things I'm dragging the outer dashed line, the leftmost part of that, or the lower part of it, sets the low pass filter cutoff, the top part of that sets the high pass filter cutoff. That's referring to those parameters over to the right here. Now we can see that the low pass filter, that's labelled LPF here, and the high pass filter HPF, those have both got LFOs active. If we turn off those LFOs by clicking the assign buttons off, that green outer arc stops moving. So if we click back on the one for the low pass filter, you can see that's moving, and we've got a huge variation in the low pass cutoff there. So if we click and hold the note, that's basically taken the sound in and out. You know, that cutoff is literally cutting it off. If we take the low pass off and put the high pass LFO back on, that didn't work. Didn't do that. Assign. That's a more subtle, less aggressive variation, but we'll try that. We can't really hear that. Let's make it more aggressive by going in and changing the range. Instead of minus 4.9, we'll go to minus 20 something. That's clearer. Let's make it even more aggressive. We change the limits of that. We should get. So that's just an interesting example of getting quite aggressive with some of these, particularly the filter parameters. So if we park that and we look at layer 1 of this, which is using a different sample, that's kind of a Hammond organ kind of sound. So layer 1 is the bottom left quadrant, not quadrant, I don't know what you pizza slice we'll call it. Again, we've got LFOs on the filters. We've got LFO on the level. No, we've got an envelope on the level. That envelope, you can see visually, it affects the way the sound swells in and out. If we look at that, it's got a it's got an exponential attack, which is kind of slow. That's the main feature of that, really, and then a long tail. If we deassign that, reassign, so you can see that swelling on the animation of that little green thing, and again the filters are animated. If we take those off, we increase the depth of that. So you can see you could go on for hours just pulling apart one of these presets, but we're going to look at a couple of others before we finish. If we go back to our empty scene preset, and then I'm just going to load up an oscillator preset into Oscillator 2. So if we go over here, click on there, it's under basses and it's called Brute Pulse. I just like this one, so I thought it'd be worth a look at. You just want to eat that with a plate of chips. What can we say about that usefully? Well, not a lot, I suppose, but let's go into Oscillator 2. We've got two layers. We've got basically the same sample, slightly detuned and octaved, if you like. So on layer 1, we've got on layer 2, simultaneously we're playing. Oh, battery's running out, gotta go. So let's look at another preset. Go to Soundscapes, Industrial Delight. You know, you can take any of these and spend hours taking them apart. This is an interesting one. A couple of things that I'm interested in with this one. In particular, if we turn off oscillators 1 and 2, and then we go into oscillator 3 and look at this. Is called hyperdrive. So hyperdrive is the name of the oscillator preset. And if we look at that, we're looking at it's got 3 different layers with 3 different samples loaded in. So already this is a complex layer, it's a complex preset. If we just isolate these, we listen to layer 3 first. So that's what it is. Listen to layer 2. Going to turn that one off. Layer 1 is the one I'm particularly interested in. It's got a weird sound to it. This is the sample. Not very interesting in its own right. Now, if you watched my previous video, I mentioned intuition as something that's helpful, you know, in getting you started with a new app, in the sense that you can transfer in domain knowledge from, well, other music apps, or in some cases from real world or other domains. You know, that's when we use metaphors such as windows and folders and documents and so on. But in another sense, you might consider that intuition can hold you back. And I'm thinking in particular, if we think about the envelopes here, you know, you might have a fixed view about what an envelope is useful for. And that's based on the fact that in many sound apps and synthesizers, we typically have an amp envelope which controls the shape of the volume, if you like, of the sound, and also a filter envelope, so modulating the cutoff of like a low pass filter. And the problem with that is that's fine as far as it goes, but your intuition might constrain you in, you know, thinking that's all envelopes are for. But here's a really good example of another use for an envelope, and it's in modulating this address parameter of layer 1 here. And in passing, it also gives us a use, perhaps an unexpected use of the address parameter itself. Now you might, if you know what this does, it essentially interferes with the retrieval of the actual sample from memory. And there's technicalities you can go into about that if you want to. If I turn off that envelope for now, and if I just hold down a key or press a key and then change that envelope, you can see it's corrupting the sample basically. Now it's not immediately obvious what use that is, other than giving you a slightly different and somewhat Well, I mean, that's kind of an interesting sound in its own right. But I mean, in effect, it's just giving you a different sample. But what we can do is we can shift that. That's a bit mask that we just created there by clicking those buttons on and off. We can shift that left and right dynamically with that slider. And the really clever bit is we can put that on the, we can animate that using an LFO, or in this case an envelope. So if we assign that back on, you can see that's what's happening. We've got that fixed bit mask that's interfering with the retrieval of the sample, but according to the envelope, that's being shifted to the right, basically on the attack phase of that envelope. And you can see, if we look at the details of that, the envelope is set with a logarithmic attack phase. We've got the attack, decay and sustain set by these dials to the bottom left, and the release is a very fast exponential release. If we look at the section where it says envelope to parameter, we're controlling the shift of that bit mask over about 50% of its range, plus, so we're going to shift it to the right. If we made that minus 50%, I hope I'm right in saying this, it would shift to the left, yeah. So we want it to shift to the right by 50, well, it was 47 or something. And it's starting off, well, it's starting off wherever I left that slider. I accidentally left it to the right by 2 units. If I move it to the left, we go in there. That's this O3L1, that's Oscillator 3 layer 1 address value is where I left it. So if I start it in the central position, so that just gives us a very, flexible and interesting finesse to start, the attack phase of this sound. Now, what could we do with that? We could, if we delayed that by 0.3 seconds. Now, this is where it's helpful to look at the graph over on the left here. Without going into too much detail, in some sense, the orange line there shows the template for this envelope. The green shows the actual. So we're starting off where the green line is. If we delay the onset of that, we're essentially skipping the attack phase, and we're going to run this transformation of the address shift mask, pretty much to the end of the attack and into the sustain phase. So that sort of flat spot at the start where we're stuck with the initial address mask, and then after a short delay it starts to move. What else could we do? If we put that delay back to 0, if we choose a different envelope for this, just press the default button a couple of times. It's a bit boring. Oh, that's cool. I can't remember what it was at the start now. Let's go back to, was it a standard envelope? I think it was that one. Or it was something like that. Let's change the attack to be longer. Now there's something you might have noticed there which is worth talking about. If I do that twice in rapid succession, it doesn't seem to play that mangling the second time. And in fact, if I press two notes shortly after each other, that envelope only runs for the first voice in this layer. Now remember, we've got up to 6 voices for this layer. So this is a limitation. We've got, although we've got 6 voices, we don't have independent envelopes for the address mask for each of those 6 voices. Now you will discover that for the level, pitch and balance parameters, we do have up to 6, well 6 in fact, independent. So if we have an envelope on the, should we try this? Let's not try this because we'll be here all day, but if we put an envelope on the volume or on the balance or on the pitch, then hold down several notes, those envelopes operate for each of those notes independently. But for address mask and the low pass and the high pass filters, that envelope only runs once, and once it's active, subsequent voices don't respond to the envelope. That's a performance limitation. That was deliberately coded that way, Igor tells me, as a concession really to the less powerful iPads. You've got to remember I'm running this on the top of the line at the time of making this video. They're just about to announce the 2019 iPads, but for now, you know, not everybody's going to have the horsepower that I've got available here, and so this is a concession to running on older iPads. You could argue it could be made configurable, and Igor has said, you know, it may well be in future versions of SynthScaper. But that aside, that limitation aside, that's just an amazing thing to play around with, and you can get some just fantastic. And in fact, as a parting shot, what we'll do is we'll take that envelope off, and we'll put an LFO on the same thing. We have an LFO already? So let's try assigning that. Let's make a different LFO. Let's unassign that. We'll go to LFO2. We'll go depth 100%, range. We had 50%. So if we go 50%, I think that'll give us plus or minus 50%. Rate, have it on 1 second. Let's try that. Oh, I haven't assigned it. Hang on. Well, it's not very aesthetically pleasing at the moment, but you can see. So you can see the potential there, if not the currently we've made a bit of a mess of it. We'll look at one last, go back to the empty preset. So Oscillator 2, we're going to reload up drones, another dimension, set that in. It's another one of those very intricate effects, kind of effect based sound, but this is just something I've noticed, and which is a consequence when you think it through. We've got this sound here, which is a sort of little kind of R2-D2 sound, if you like. I just thought I'd point this out quickly. this is a consequence. These sounds are all based on samples. This sample is loaded in, and then it's tuned to a particular bass frequency. And of course, when you vary it, it changes the frequency of the bass sample, inevitably. Now, for samples like this one, where there's actually built-in or burned-in texture or oscillation, that has very noticeable consequences. So if we play different notes here, if you listen to that sort of thing that sounds like a sonar ping, it's coming about every second. If I play another note, in fact, if I try and play them simultaneously, they go out of sync. And we can see another example of that if I look for, which one is it? Basses, talk. We go in there, layer 2. Which layer is it? Try layer 1. Now that sample has got a sort of delay built in. And so again, if we play different notes there, the speed of that oscillation, of that delay, is different. And so if I play two notes, we get an effect as those two things start to interfere. And I mean, I'm just pointing that out for what it's worth. That's not a drawback or an advantage. It's either or both, depending on your perspective. It's just another feature of a lot of this is about the emergent. This is so fantastically complex. All the things I've looked at in this video today, and all the other things that you'll discover. There's a point at which you can no longer predict exactly what's going to happen, and that's part of the beauty of it, really. You're prospecting for interesting sounds, mining for useful, unexpected consequences of interactions such as the one we've just seen. So I think that's all we'll say for now. So maybe you want to go off and do a bit of that for yourself, and if I come up with anything more that's interesting from my experiments, maybe I'll come back and tell you about it.